Hello, Lisa Congo. Welcome to the Wax Museum.
Thank you. I feel particularly waxy today, so it's good.
Oh, well, that's perfect. Yeah. It's so funny. We always in early episodes, people would always we would always like joke that we have like listeners that are asking, why is it called the Wax Museum? And we just like I'd always shrug it off and not answer the question.
Build the suspense and the interest,
Yeah.
hey?
Yeah. Should I give it away right now?
Do it.
I
But
could.
then we can just like obfuscate later and just be like, actually, we're just kidding. That isn't what it meant at all.
So me and a group of buddies got together when our dear friend Byron Porritt passed away from cancer, and his wife was the children's pastor at our church. And so we got together and we were talking about really like different things that we wanted to do, different creative pursuits that we wanted to pursue. And so my friend Jason kept talking about how he wants to move to Victoria. And every time Victoria came up, I'm like, is that anywhere near the Wax Museum? And so then we were like, hey, we should have a name for like our Facebook group where we talk about these different ideas of what we want to do. And so I decided to call that the Wax Museum. And that's basically
Awesome.
the story. But it's like, it kind of ends up being in memory of Byron, who was just an inspirational guy, super sweet. And his wife and kids still miss him dearly. It's really sad.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, that's a great way to honor somebody too, right? That's legacy, which I think everybody wants to be able to leave, right? Something that speaks well of them beyond them. So that's cool. I love that.
I just hope that like people will laugh at something dumb I said. That'll be my legacy.
That's like shooting fish in a barrel for me.
Yeah. I know. This is gonna be good. This is gonna be so good. I'm so happy to have you here. So I
Thank you.
basically wanted to have you on to share your story,
Okay.
mainly because it's easier for me to prepare when I just ask you to share your story. And then we don't have a topic and I don't have to actually ask questions.
Yes, rise to mediocrity. I get it. That's good.
Well, I don't think your story will be mediocre though. So
Well, we will hope. I'll zhuzh it up.
so tell me about your childhood.
Oh, well, I'm born and raised in Calgary, so
Okay.
I don't know how many of us there are. They say there's not that many of us, but I keep running into us.
Oh.
So, yeah, born and raised for the most part in Calgary. And yeah, my childhood, I have an older sister and a younger brother. And we have always been a part of church and church circles and stuff like that my whole life. So, church has obviously played a big part in my kind of journey. And I was always a kid that asked why. So my mom often tells the story about when I was a little girl, she would have to keep making the answers she would give me more and more complicated because I was too proud to admit that I didn't understand what she was talking about. So I'd constantly be asking, well, why? And what about that? And why? And why? And she'd make her answers more and more complex until I finally was too proud. And she'd be like, do you understand? And I was too proud to say, no, I don't know what you're talking about. I'd be like, sure. And then I'd shut up. And stop asking her. So that's been kind of, I would think of when I think about my childhood, that's definitely, I would say something that's continued throughout my whole life is not really ever accepting um the not accepting the status quo or how people describe things or people in authority of, I'm a person who's deeply committed to the rules and to following the rules if they make sense. And that's the big caveat. Yeah, if you can,
Yeah.
if leaders, authorities, teachers, parents, whatever, couldn't explain to me why the rule was in place, I felt no, and still don't feel any kind of compulsion to follow it unless there's like, it's illegal or something and the consequences are too great to bear. So, yeah, I would say that's kind of, if I think about things that sort of described me kind of growing up, it was always questioning, wondering, wrestling, which is why, when I moved on later into life and kind of focused in an area of study, it's not a big surprise that I focused on wrestling with God and with church stuff because it was pretty much indicative of my childhood. Always sort of wondering, well, why do I have to do this? And if there was a good answer, I follow it. I don't deviate from it. But
Yeah.
there's a lot of rules, and I've worked for years and years and years with children, and have taken that into the work that I do as well. I feel like as adults, we have a default to saying no to kids on principle. Like, can I
Right.
like
Right.
can I like rub this, sidewalk chalk all over my face? Most of us would go, no, because we don't want to clean up the mess or whatever, or it's
Yeah.
just our default mode.
Yeah.
And for me, when I started working with kids, it was like, I wanted to make myself stop that impulse and go, well, just think about it. Is there a danger issue? Is it a safety issue? And if it
Right.
isn't, why not say yes and let them figure things out? And so,
Yeah.
yeah, so that's been kind of fun to engage in now as, a leader of a team and stuff. That's definitely now a very it's my starting point is when a team member or staff comes up and go, I'm thinking about doing this, instead of saying no and already running through the barrage of why this won't work, starting to go, well, yes, let's talk about it. Talk to me more. What would that do? What it would accomplish? What's your purpose with it? And then just empowering them to move forward with a yes instead of a no all the time. So I wish I had received more yeses than nos when I was growing up.
Yeah. No, that's beautiful. And sounds like it set you up really well. Like, I know for me, there was a lot of guilt in questioning up
Mm-hmm,
until I think it was teenagehood where I started to realize, it's okay to question.
mm-hmm.
I was watching a Meg Ryan movie, and it was the one with Einstein in it. I think it's called IQ.
Oh, IQ. Yeah.
Yeah, and where Albert Einstein says, question everything. And that kind of hit me, and I'm like, question everything? I can't do that as a Christian, can I? And it took me a while to realize it's like, yes, I can, because if it's true,
Mm-hmm.
it should bear the questioning.
It'll hold up. Yeah.
And it's crazy to me because it's like, of late, I'm starting to realize just how much cognitive bias there is within faith circles. It's like they have their preconceptions with everything, and they're
Mm-hmm.
not really thinking critically about it.
Mm-hmm.
It's like they'd rather think critically about science than what they're taught in the church.
Mm-hmm.
And they
Mm-hmm.
don't
And
have
how
the
boring is that, right? Like,
yeah,
question everything is a big
yeah,
adventure. Like,
yeah.
I think for me, I definitely resonate with the feeling, not feeling guilt, but getting in trouble. Like, I was
Hmm.
definitely rebuked a tremendous amount during my childhood and my adolescence and young adult life for asking the questions and pushing,
Yeah,
and actually, wanting the adults to answer the questions, not just kind of like shut me up with some kind of pat answer.
yeah,
And then when it really got into like questioning God, his character, how he works, definitely the rebukes, the commentary on the veracity or quality of my faith started happening.
yeah.
And I think there was a part of me that it didn't make me feel guilty. It made me feel despair sometimes because I
Mm,
knew I couldn't control it. Like I couldn't stop being me. And
yeah.
so it was like I was pushed into this place where I'm like, well, if this is bad and wrong, then I'm bad and wrong. And I don't know what to
Wow.
do then. What are my choices? So there were a number of times where I considered walking away from my faith entirely because
Yeah.
I was like, if the only way that I can, honestly pursue what I feel like I'm actually like created to pursue, is to leave the confines of this faith and this religion, but thankfully God really always intercepted some amazing mentors into my
Mm,
life that were able to kind of reframe that and give me hope that maybe I wasn't doing it bad, right?
wow.
That maybe the institution was the problem and not me as the problem. Yeah.
That's a big thing, because it's like I feel like every time I question the institution, there's people that are like, "Oh, not all churches are like that."
Right.
And there's a lot of defensiveness and
Mhm.
no self-reflection.
Yes.
And even the lack of self-reflection is something that seems to be ubiquitous within the faith
Yep.
community. It's like,
Yeah.
they don't care how they come off. They just need to speak the truth. But
Yeah.
it's like these truth speakers are most often people that you cannot reason with.
Yes.
And it's a frustrating thing. I'm like, I don't know what to do anymore.
Well, and I think there is a point, like, Jesus has that when he sends them off, when he sends his disciples off, right? To not to throw your pearls before swine, to kick the dust off
Mm,
your feet, right? And I think that we tend to hear tone with Christ in that. And actually, I think he's just being super pragmatic about it. Like there is a point where it's you're literally wasting your time
yeah.
sometimes, and there's a time to just sort of cut it and walk with the leaders. And that took me a long time though. Like I just left the church that I was with for about 22, 25 years in there,
Yeah.
because I was like, I've literally tried everything I can do and they don't want me or what I have to offer. And it just became really clear they're not going to change. I'm not going to waste any more of my vital kind of like service and spiritual, kind of journey years investing in a place that has no vision to move forward with the stuff that matters to me and what I feel like God really cares about. So I'm
Yeah.
like, then it's best to just leave with as much peace as possible
Yeah.
towards them. Yeah. And grace as possible. So,
I don't know if you've heard like Rob Bell's take on the whole pearls and swine,
mm.
but he's kind of like, you give pearls to a pig and the pig will put it in its mouth and try to eat it, and they'll be like,
Mhm,
well, this is useless to me.
mhm.
And then it kind of gets you thinking, well, why do humans have so much value in pearls? Like maybe we're the ones that are not very smart.
Yeah. It
It's
serves
like,
no earthly purpose. Why are we so, yeah.
and so it gave me a lot more humility with that term, because so
Mm,
often I always thought of like, oh, don't want to cast pearls before swine. And I'm thinking of that person as a lowly pig. But in
right.
reality, it's like maybe what I'm saying is just useless to them because
Yes.
they're a different species. Like really, like there's
Yeah.
and yeah, so to take away the hierarchy from it, I think is such a beautiful thing. And I think it makes
Mhm.
it easier too to be at like, all right, well, I wish you well without me.
Yes, exactly. I think there's kindness
Yeah.
embedded in that. I mean, obviously, the imagery isn't like people get hung up on the imagery,
Yeah.
but the truth is, like, continuing to harangue and harass, like for
Yeah.
me, my leaders who I actually still love and
Yeah.
appreciate as human beings. We just have vastly different understandings of what the call and the urgency of the call for the church in our culture is.
Yeah.
And but I don't wish them ill. They're good people. They love their families still. But the kindness is I don't need to harangue them and harass them any more than I have. They don't want what I have. So there's
Yeah.
like pride and hurt for that I have to work through. But we don't have to like everybody, like contrary to, church ease. We don't have to like everybody.
Hmm.
I think it's the same with church. Not every church is for every person. So yeah, just walk away.
So it's interesting because like you're kind of saying they want to offer something to the world, but you think they should be like the church should be offering something different. So what's the difference, do you think?
I think so, and I will say this not just of because I don't want my old church to feel like I'm speaking directly about them. It's a larger
No,
issue for me with
absolutely.
evangelicalism. I
Absolutely. Yep.
think they've lost their compass, not their
Mm,
I think they've lost their moral compass on a lot of levels too, but they've just lost their plumb line. And so they have become so much about, I think there's a lot of fear that they're
yeah.
operating with.
Yeah.
And they have lost their sense of like the really like motivating / terrifying verses in the Bible for me are the ones where God makes it very clear what his call and his purpose for his people, right, is. And that's like, to serve the widows, the orphans, to visit the people in prison, to help the marginalized, the vulnerable. Like he makes that super clear in a number of places in scripture. I think they've lost that that's actually that's still valid, and that call is still presently our call. They seem quite lost and myopic. And I call them the grand navel gazers. Like they are so intent on like discerning where the Lord is that they actually have lost all sense of where he actually is, and that he's made it really clear where he is. Because I find their vision for how radical God and Christ. I don't know if that's even theologically the right way to say it, but anyway, I think they have a very, very narrow, safe picture and definition of who he is. And since I've been in social work, my definition and understanding of who God is and how the what he calls us to and the places that he'll take us to is really radical and way far outside of any kind of boundaries that I was ever allowed to kind of operate within when I either worked in the church or attended church. And so I think they've just lost their sense of how radical Christ was, right? They're used to flannel board Jesus instead of real skin and bones Jesus, who was like, he's a shit disturber. Can I say that? He was a rabble rouser.
It's all
I
good.
just did it. Wow.
It's all good.
He was a rabble rouser.
Much worse things have been said on this podcast
Well,
by
excellent.
me.
Well, that gives me a lot of free reign, and you'll regret that, I'm sure, at some point. But yeah, he was very, very radical. And I think that they've lost their sense. And now I think there's such a system. It's become such a big, big, big institution and machine to try to push against all of the systems and all of the ways of doing that have existed. Is a big ask, because so I would have meetings with pastors from my church, and they'd get all fired up as we talk about, and they'd get back connected to the right. Like, this is exciting. This makes faith. Like, let's do this. And then they immediately like leave the meeting with me and go into church meetings where it like completely dulls their senses again and like puts them back into kind of the coma of serving the machine. And so I feel like it's very robotic and not very alive right now.
It is a machine. I like to call it the ministry industrial complex.
Yes, that's awesome.
It's crazy because it's like, and it's never been more evident than when, like, we were forced to shut down due to a pandemic.
Right.
And you could see just how obvious it was. It's like, we need this revenue. Yes. And it's like, but like, why? And like, even, just sitting in the church, I remember there's a smaller church that I've been to a few times. And every time someone went up to talk, on the screen, it showed their name and their title. And I'm like, what are we doing here? Like, we're pretending that this is like a really important corporation, and we're so fixated on feeding the machine and, having worship excellence, which I've been part of the worship team. It's fun, but it's just like, why are we doing all this? Why am I stressed out trying to get my bass notes to play exactly where they need to play?
Yeah.
And there's just all of this so that we can create this atmosphere where people have this encounter, and then the message hits, and then we go through the week, and I'm like, I don't see better people coming out of the church. And when I say that, people are like, oh, well, humans are human and all this stuff. And I'm like, no, like, if we're not changed, then what are we even doing? Like, we're not making the world a better place. So can we strip this down?
Mm-hmm. And I think there's another word for all of that. It's manipulation.
Yeah.
Right. And so I've led worship for years too. And I've asked for years, I'm like, how do we know when we've crossed the line between removing obstacles and barriers that could keep people from encountering God straight into manipulating an experience? Right. Because the right music at the right tone and the right build creates it can be Christian or not Christian, and you'll get a similar reaction. So, how do we know that we're just not manipulating reaction from people under the guise of like removing barriers and creating a safe space for people to? It's like, where's that line, right, between manipulating an experience and actually? And I think um the pandemic was super interesting, and the
Yeah.
picture that I have is that you have all these sheep out in the pasture that are like going, actually I'm doing pretty good without these church shepherds. Actually, we've been doing fine. We don't. And they're like, come, let us take care of you. And they're like, yeah, like we're not missing that at all, and we've managed to like kind of find our own food, and we're doing okay. Like, what purpose do you serve, right, in this? And I think that's been really eye-opening to go, I actually don't miss church.
Yeah, no, my experience was quite similar, where it's just like I don't miss it. And I think what was really interesting is that it's been like a saying in the church for quite some time. If you miss church, if you stop going to church, you're not gonna miss it. And I'm like, what? And I remember like saying, yeah, oh yeah, that's a good warning. And now I'm looking back, I'm like, why wouldn't I miss it?
Yeah. Well, exactly. Like, we should ask her. But okay, do you remember back like in the campfire days at like when
Yeah,
you go to summer camp and there was that skit, or they'd use the picture of like all of the pieces of wood together to be together to get the spark. And if you
right.
take one of those logs away, it like dies out on its own. It needs to be together, in the community, feel, to be all fired up and stuff like that. And the truth is, and they were obviously the analogy being, if you don't go to church, if you're not in the community, if you're not, that somehow this is going to be detrimental to your faith. I agree with that if we have a better understanding of what community is, right? And what we're talking about with church, right? Being outside of the institution, I've actually felt more free, more at peace with God. I've grown in my faith more than I have for the last number of years in church, in the institutional kind of church setting. But I have community. I have people
Yeah,
that I meet with regularly. We are
yeah.
reading, we're challenging each other, but it's not happened in the confines of the institutional church. And now it's like, do I want to go back there?
Well,
Like,
that's
mm,
and that's it, right? Like it's a very inefficient model for making world changers. Like you just, even, these conferences, when you go to a conference, like I remember even like youth conferences, it was kind of the same thing where you just like you are hyped, and then you go back to school or you go back home, and that just kind of fades after a while.
I
And
call
it's
them
like if
spiritual porn. Like Willow Leadership Summit, all of those, it's just like pump you up, but like with
yeah,
no actionable way to
yeah,
make any of that stuff happen outside of the context of a really large church with massive resources. Right, you go, you get all pumped up. It's like going to summer camp, like as a kid, Bible camp, right? You like get all pumped up for that week, but making the transition into, oh, but we go back into like real life, right? The real issues that existed prior to my engagement at that conference. My real life relationships are still broken and in process. And how do we actually integrate any of these great ideas in a way that's actually sustainable, that makes sense? Is that our call particular? Is our church really called to do this? That's a question I never heard talked about any of those, right? Is this actually, attainable, or a call for all churches? Do they all need to be this way? And I think as we've kind of seen the tumbling of a lot of the leaders of these big churches, mega churches, I think there's some reflection that needs to happen there too about, are we made for these big expressions of the body of Christ, right? Being the leader of those is an inherently dangerous role.
yeah. It certainly is. And I mean, I think even looking at like what what can we, like, when we bring a large group of people together and then we say, okay, now this pastor is going to minister to this large group of people, and what God has to say to this large group of people is what this dude is saying, and he, for whatever reason, he's on the right frequency to speak into the lives of this massive group of people, when in reality it's like, if you had like your three friends that you meet with weekly, they may be able to pour into you. I mean, they're gonna know more about you. They're gonna be able to pour into you in a better
Mhm,
way than this mega
mhm.
church guy will.
Well, it's very papal,
Yeah,
frankly, right?
it
Like,
is.
what's the difference between, these big oracles of our faith, right? The Billy Grahams or the Bill Hybels or what's the difference between them and the authority, the unthinking loyalty that gets handed over to them? What's different between that and what we've always in evangelical circles criticized the Catholic Church for doing with the Pope,
Hmm.
right?
Hmm.
Unthinkingly given all of this authority, right, over and believing lock, stock, and barrel everything that comes out of that person's mouth, right? It's like, yeah, we're human, right? The problem is we're not equipped to hold that kind of power. We're really
And we're
not.
and you're told to go back into scripture and double check what the pastor said,
Mhm.
and then write him a nasty email if you don't like what he said.
Yeah.
How's that system working? I think usually people just email them with petty things.
Oh yeah, like they don't like the color of the like pews and the hymn books are like old and yeah, the worship music, right? We need more hymns. I hate hymns, less hymns. Yeah. It is the stupid stuff generally that like provokes like, and I think, or actually what I see more now is people are pretty well, okay, there's always going to be complainers and whiners. So that's true.
Yeah.
Poor
Yep.
blessings on pastors who have to listen to the
Yeah.
cantankerous curmudgeons. I get that.
Yeah.
But I feel like more and more churches, at least the churches I've been involved with, have systematically removed engagement with pastors, way out of the regular and the norm, right? So, if you want to engage in a fulsome discussion about a sermon or a question you had about it in a way that's like civil and passionate, but really kind and gracious and respectful, I find pastors are wholly ill-equipped to do that.
Hmm.
They don't know how to I feel like they're either they either don't have the time or they're very they get defensive, right? They feel
Yeah.
like you're pushing against them, and heaven forbid if you have a legitimate question
Yeah.
about or a confrontation or challenge about some leadership, you get just painted as being a huge troublemaker. And
Yeah.
yeah, which,
I
has been a label I've worn a lot.
I hate that label so much, and I've
Uh-huh.
gotten it a lot, and it's like, you don't understand my heart.
Yep.
I want us to be better. I mean, like, I made a post on Facebook. My new thing on Facebook now, because I've been like disengaging from Facebook so much. And now I post on Facebook, but I only check like once a week. So I'll
Yes.
post all week, but I don't check any of my notifications until Monday. And every once in a while, I'll see something that someone replied to me with, right? And I was reading in scripture, and there was just one verse that really got to me where it said, "Don't permit a sorceress to live." And I was like, this doesn't sit right with me. Like, what do I do with this? Why did it say
Mhm.
sorceress and not sorcerer? And why are we talking about unaliving people? And and I saw like one of my friends, had replied and said, just find a good commentary and move on. And I'm like, this is the problem. You find a commentary that explains it away, and then you move on with your life. And it's like, this like illustrates the problem with the church so
Yes.
well.
Yeah, and I think they're, either the congregants themselves or the lay leaders or the pastors are really biblically illiterate for functionally, I think. So I've had lots of friends that have that are atheists, right? That are like, I have huge trouble with, the Bible, and, they cite
Yeah.
all of that. I'm like, oh, I've got more. Do you want more ammo? I can give
Yeah,
you
yeah,
more.
yeah.
How about the passage where God says, bring a lying spirit to me. I'll put a lie in those prophets' mouths. And then they'll
Yeah.
draw out a guy to like
Yeah.
murder him on the front lines by God using a lying spirit. My friends are like, what? I'm
Oh,
like,
I know.
yeah. I'm
And
like,
it's
there's
like,
some troubling
but it
stuff in
was,
there.
but it was all for his glory. I mean, that's like, that's the Calvinist answer. And I'm like, no, this is
Okay. Yeah.
and I'm like, I don't know what to do with a lot of this.
Yeah.
It's like we deconstruct, and I think like, and I guess this kind of works into what you were saying about wrestling with God. What's that term? How do you say
Theomachi. Theomachi.
theomachi? Oh,
Yeah. It's a
you should
good one.
name your kid that, but the idea of wrestling with God, and I think that like, I honestly think deconstruction is something we should be doing with like everything.
Hmm.
We should be doing it with our relationships too, and just be like, you know what? We need to pull this apart and back up and figure out like what's working here and what's not
Hmm.
working here. And it's like,
Hmm.
why are we holding on to all this stuff that doesn't work? Like we're not like, I feel like a lot of things like politics is another one where it's just like the old like cable packages that you would buy. It's like, I only like hockey. I don't need any of the other sports,
Yeah.
but I have to buy the package that has like 10 different sports channels. I I just want to watch the Canucks. I know I'm in the wrong city, but
Oh,
I just want to watch the Canucks, right?
yikes,
But
John.
that's kind of it though, right? It's like, okay, well, I'm a Christian, therefore I have to buy the whole package. So I read a
Yes.
commentary and I move on and continue to believe what I believe. And it's like, that's not a rational way to look at anything. Like you got to put it on the line and say, if this doesn't make sense, I'm ready to give up on it.
Hmm.
Like anything else is not logical. Like,
Hmm. And
and
I
that's
think,
scary for a lot of people. But I feel
I,
like I've
yeah,
been
it's
doing
very
this
scary for
since I
them.
was a teenager, where I'm like, I'm going to put all this on the line because I'm not sure.
Yes. Good for you.
And like for me, though, it's kind of like I'm at a point now where I'm like, I can't let go of this concept that God is love.
Yes.
And I'm looking at people and I'm like, I don't care what your faith is. If it's Allah, if it's Buddhism, if it's atheism, I don't care what it is. Pursue love because I believe God is love. And I think that's what we need to do. And ask for forgiveness when we fall short of love. And that's my whole faith right now. And I
Right.
still read scripture every day, but I'm still trying
Yeah.
to kind of like, I'm like, man, the whole killing sorceresses thing, I'm like, I don't know what to do with that. And I'm kind of curious as to what my Facebook friends think of that, but I'm pretty sure they are all just explaining it away and not
Yes.
like critically looking at it and saying, this is messed up.
Yeah. The hermeneutical theological tap dance, right? And
Mm,
gymnastics to try to like twist and turn and make these things fit within a narrow kind of theological framework that somehow always comes out with God being awesome and doing things that we love. And
yeah.
it's like, yeah, like he is all of those things, but we don't know him and we don't get him. And
We don't.
we've been told we won't see all this side of full revelation, right? And so releasing ourselves from that expectation is a very scary but also freeing journey as well, because I think people think like legitimately when I would get rebuked and people would be afraid, it came from a good place from them. I'll give them that
Yeah.
grace, that it came from a good place, that they were concerned about. If you start pulling at that thread, it all unravels. And I'm like,
Yeah.
if it all unravels, it's crap.
A
It's
hundred
not
percent.
Scottish, it's crap. So if
Well,
you
and
pull at
that's
that
totally
thread,
it.
right?
Because it's like their God kills infants, but they're against abortion. Like there's so many things like that. And it's like once you say, well, God's okay with killing sorceresses, it's like, okay, what kind of God are you serving? And what kind of person are you becoming? Because now you're looking at it and saying, like, it's okay to be fiercely partisan and talk about how much hatred you have toward the other political side. And it's like, but that's not a God that's love that you're serving. And that's not you trying to emulate that. It's not you trying to live love.
Mhm.
And I'm like, that's the problem. It's like when you guys start explaining away these passages, you're now okay with a lot
Mhm.
of evil and
Mhm.
saying that your God does evil. And you're
Mhm.
using it to justify you doing evil too. And I'm like, I don't want anything to do with any of that. Nobody wants anything to do with that. But
No.
you tell them that, and they're like, well, that's because the world is sinful. They can't see how holy and how loving we are. It's like some mad gaslighting going on.
Oh, big time. And that's why, like, I think I think a lot of things. What am I trying to spit out here? I think that um there's big gaslighting, and we're so entrenched in this culture. Like, some of us, like, I'm a cradle, right, from the minute,
Yeah.
like, weeks after I was born, I was already in church, kind of like
Yeah.
evangelical Christian.
Yeah.
And I think those of us in that situation, which is a lot of people that I see on Twitter and social media and
Yeah.
stuff, we're so steeped in this to even think that we can create an alternative expression of church, right? I'm skeptical because it's in our bones and in our, like, it we don't, we're still, we have to deconstruct this stuff to understand uh how we arrived where we're at. And then at that point, perhaps we could possibly come up with an alternative that isn't just going to turn into the next iteration of the crap heap that currently exists, or the dumpster fire that exists, right? And so I could be overly cynical about that. I will own that. But there is unthinking, we're very unthinkingly
Yeah.
accepting of what we have been, and it's so cultural that it's really difficult for us to try to, like, pull out, okay, what is biblical, what is theological, and what is culture, and the way that we have decided to piece these things together to make culture that we can live and work within. Well, certain people can live and work within. And so it's very destabilizing when you have these people that start to pull the threads and ask the questions, because we don't stop to think about these things, right? And the people
No.
that are always rushing for the answers, right, to explain it all away, there's this great place to be able to sit in it and go, I don't know. And if you have
Yeah.
a problem with it, how much more do I have a problem with that? Because I say that I serve that God, right?
Yeah.
Like, I get what you're talking about. That's a problem.
It
Um,
is.
yeah, we can live in the tension and not die, right? You can live
Mm-hmm.
in the tension and actually have your faith expand and grow with God. Wrestling with God is not antithetical to relationship with God. In fact, it's a critical piece of relationship with God. And how I wish that had been taught to me, if I'd had people in my young adult and youth times that really understood that. So instead of rebuke, they'd go, this is cool. You've got a journey
Mm.
going on.
Yeah.
Like, what do you need to be able to do this safely and wisely? Like, we're here. Here's some great things that will challenge you even further, instead of, like, shutting it down, right? And
Mm.
then making it seem like we're the bad ones, when actually I think we're the ones that we were hearing God and following his direction. Did we always act properly in the midst of that? No, I for sure didn't. But I didn't always make the right choices with everything. But the impulse to question, to push, to challenge, that I am convinced that that would have been a part of how we, if we'd never had original sin and Adam and Eve had never sinned, whatever you feel about that theological framework, if it had been stayed perfect, right, and untouched, I still think this would be a part of how we engage with God. I actually
I
don't
think
think
so
it's a
too.
result of the sin or bad. I think this is
Mm.
how he intended to build
Oh my
connection and
gosh.
relationship.
Yeah. Well, for sure. And it's like, and I want to use the term divine unraveling.
Mm.
I don't know if I've heard anyone say that before, but
Oh,
I just
coin
like,
it, copyright.
I love the term. I'm just like, it hit me. I was going to make a tweet about it. I can't remember what exactly I was going to say, but it was like, instead of deconstruction, what if we called it the divine unraveling? And I mean, I
Mm.
look at these people who are losing their faith, and I mean, I see my own children struggle with their
Hmm.
faith, and I look at them and I'm like, you know what? I'm not angry at you.
Hmm.
I'm I want you to find a loving place with all of this. I want
Mhm.
you to find love.
Yeah.
And then I'm thinking, okay, now I believe that God is the divine father. He's a way better father than I am.
Mhm.
And he's mad? I don't think so. I think he's looking upon them with love and just being like, keep asking those questions,
Mhm.
and it's like, let's figure out how we can find healing of this cynicism, because these Christian spaces have done so much damage. I've
Yeah.
seen so much damage. And a lot of it is people clinging to certainty
Yes.
and trying to, it's out of fear that we're
Mhm.
going to lose what we have.
Mhm.
And it's kind of at a point now where I'm kind of like, well, you guys can have that.
Yeah.
And if you're happy with that, cool. But I'm doing something different here.
Yeah.
And it's like, and it's a divine unraveling, and I'm going to find love.
Yeah.
And I'm going to be reformed into the image of love. And
Mhm.
that's going to be evident to people.
Yes.
And that's what I want. And I'm like, I'm not interested in anything else. And so, I mean, like, you guys can have the perfect music and the wonderful, well-dressed preacher with lovely sneakers. You guys can have all of that. I don't care.
Yeah.
But I'm finding something totally different. And I feel like it's a lot closer to what Jesus was bringing.
Mhm. I just feel equipped to be in that space. I
Yeah.
have never felt equipped to do church the way that it happens, right? It's
Yeah.
always coming from a place of deficit as opposed to going, here's who I am. This is what I have to offer.
Yeah.
God, you enliven it, you illuminate it, you empower it. And I've got fish and loaves. That's what I have to offer. But if I
Fish
have
and
to have
loaves.
like all of it figured out before I can actually be on a worship team or a
Yeah.
Christian leader or whatever, like we're already set up to fail when that's the standard, right? Because we can't be that.
Well, it's interesting because it's like, keep up this image, right? But it's like, but yet we have people that fail in big ways. It's like abuse is the only forgivable sin. And that's effed.
Yeah.
That's
Yeah,
really
that's
effed.
completely messed
See,
up.
I didn't
Yeah.
say the word.
Well done.
Well, and that's what we're seeing, right? Is like, if it's someone who's a bully, who's abusive, it's like well, we're
Extend
all
grace.
human. But it's
Mhm.
like, but like, if it's a person who, you know, I don't know, like the whole, like, purity, I guess, is the thing, and so fixated with purity that it's like the church has said that the highest form of sexual morality is covenant,
Mhm.
and the world has said that the highest state of sexual morality is consent. And I'm like, I think the church has it wrong. I mean, and I think, like, consent and covenant, awesome, right?
Mhm.
But if we just have consent without covenant, it's like, it's slavery.
Mhm.
And we've been pushing slavery for I don't know how long. I guess
Yeah.
from the beginning, maybe.
Yeah.
So it was funny. My mother was telling me about how she was her pastor preached on Esther, and just basically explained that Esther's whole situation, it was like The Bachelor. And it was like he slept with all those women and all this stuff, and it was kind of eye-opening for her. But I'm like, well, that's the thing, is like, women were property, and it's like she wasn't even morally culpable for whatever went on there.
No.
Just like, a lot of the slaves in the United States, during the slavery times, it's like those women had no control over their body, and they were basically used. And it's like, and so that's kind of been there historically. I mean, those are people who claim to be Christians too, right? And so all of this time, it's like consent was not considered at all. But it's like covenant. We care about covenant. It's like, you got to be married. It's got to be one man, one woman, and all
Mhm.
this stuff. And it's like all these rules that we kind of put around it.
Mhm.
And we got kids that we're raising that are like scared of sex. And there's no like real concept of consent, because it's like, oh, you just got to wait for the covenant. And then it's like, then everything will be fixed. And it's like, yeah. And so we got all these men that fall because they can't do covenant. And it's
Yes.
like, but it's because I think also it's big. I'm going on a tear here. It's a big emotional health thing. How do
Hmm.
I know that? Because as a man, I've struggled that way. And
Hmm.
it's like, it's a misuse of, sex.
Yeah.
If you're using that to cope, and you probably see that in your work all the time, that it's like,
Hmm.
all these men are like super unhealthy and they're using women.
Hmm.
And it's like, that's the problem. It's like, if we are able to get our men emotionally healthy, consent actually could happen. And we could actually work with this. And I think so many problems in the world would be solved if we got people emotionally healthy. And it's like, this toxic masculinity is like, just, it's blowing up
Yeah.
everything. It's
Yeah.
what's driven the ministry industrial complex. Like, all of it
Hmm.
is just high testosterone. And it's like, don't talk about your feelings, be a man, and you need to lead. You need to tell women to be quiet, and it's like, it's so evil. And it's like, if we, and I love like Kootenai Girl, I think it was the first time I had her on my podcast. She kept talking about consent, and it
Hmm.
didn't click with me initially, but I'm like, she's talking, that's everything. Like, that's everything.
Hmm.
And that's what love is. And it's like,
Yes.
so if God is love, consent's going to be part of it.
Well, I mean, Ephesians, right? Paul talks about mutual submission. That's what
Yeah.
consent is, right? It's
Yeah.
mutually submitting to each other, right?
Yeah.
And making sure that each other is there and wants this, and that the power differential is laid down, right? And
Yeah.
I think, at the root of a lot of this stuff is, patriarchy, right? And, we're always really careful about, like, well, we don't want to say complementarianism is a bad thing. And I would say neither is a dictatorship in a perfect concept in the ideal, right? But it
Oh, I
never
love
works
that.
out right,
Yeah.
right? And so you
A
have to factor
benevolent
in,
dictator, right? Yeah.
which I try to be,
Yeah,
but it
exactly.
just doesn't work. So,
Yeah.
yeah, like in theory, any, kind of relational model that you use would work. Right.
Yeah.
Because at the basis of it, it would be people that are ultimately focused on the best for each other and for their community. That's just not the world we live in, though. So,
No.
functionally, complementarianism is a very, very dangerous model of relationships and understanding the role between genders and relationships between genders. Because it already sets up, there will never be, like, you can't have power differentials in this kind of world and in this culture without the people who have the power misusing that power and abusing the people that are underneath and are that don't have the power. And so that's the
Yeah.
concern that I have with that is, sure, complementarianism, whatever, in theory it's great, but it doesn't actually function that way. We're not perfect beings in acting out these models. We're broken humans enacting them.
Well, and even, if you consider like heteronormativity and
Mhm.
I don't know if cis normativity is a
Yeah.
word, but I'll use it.
Yeah.
I coined a term. No, I'm just kidding. Um,
Copyright.
yeah, yeah. But it's like, okay, so like with that's those are the assumptions with complementarianism, but then it also
Mhm.
assumes that gender is very binary. And
Yes,
it's
it
like,
does.
and I know I'm a guy, but I've never really like matched everything that a guy is supposed to be. And I always felt like I had to live up to that. Like, I'm also
Hmm.
like, I'm a highly sensitive person. Guys aren't
Hmm.
supposed to be highly sensitive.
Right.
And that's been a massive thing to me, like for me to understand that it's okay to be me. Like when
Yes.
you were talking about you had to be okay with questioning, and it's like, well, I was designed to be this way. Well, I was designed to feel everything. And
Right.
it's like, I can't stop doing that. And so it doesn't bode well for being the, iron fist with everything, right? And so
Right.
I think like, and when you read Jesus and John Wayne, I always get
Hmm.
Jesus and John Wayne and Making a Biblical Womanhood like mixed up. So I'm probably mixing both books because they all kind of tell the same story. Like it all comes
They
together,
do.
right?
Yeah.
But you can see that it's like so evident that as the church taught like a more like defined roles for men and women, it really pushed against anybody who didn't fit that mold, which made it highly abusive to, people who were, outside of the norm.
Yes.
And this creates a lot of issues with people who have gender identity issues. It's
Yeah.
like, well, it's going to exasperate it further. Like I'd imagine your gender dysphoria would be like way out of whack
Yeah.
if you were in like, and it's like, if we could just let people be who they are, like it's, and I know like the whole like homosexuality is a big issue because the church, Paul's mentioned that it's bad or whatever, but I'm just like, yeah, but Paul also said that better to be married so they don't burn with passion, but that only applies to heterosexual people. And I'm like,
Right.
that's so messed up. Like, I'm
Yeah.
like allow people to have their own journey and they can figure out how they want to wrestle with Paul on it. But it's like, I love, like, I would rather we pursue love and pursue consent rather than try to figure out what's the right covenant for everybody and how do we make everybody fit this kind of like uniform way of being.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, also don't forget, Paul also said it's actually better to be single. But
Mm.
if you're weak, then you can get married.
Yeah,
Right.
I
So
know, I
I'd
know.
just like to say on behalf of single people, actually,
Well, and that's the
Paul
thing. Like,
led that
I
as the
think
higher
it's,
ideal.
yeah, for sure. And when I think about like, and people like to bring that into like, they're like, well, there's a lot of heterosexual single people, and I'm like, yeah, but like when you try to apply that to all gay people, I would say that there's some gay people that actually meet people and fall in love with them, and it's like, no, 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 you need to be like these single people, right?
Mhm.
And so I mean, like, I think there's a big difference too between somebody who has actually met somebody and somebody who's like, there's just, I haven't met someone who's for me, or
Yeah.
I have high standards, none of them match up, right? But
Yep. That's true for
yeah,
me.
and I think that's also like, it's a beautiful thing. I think the single life, I can see, like, for me, it's like my life has always had a lot of responsibility. And I remember when I first got out of college, or when I was first in college, there was like this bus that pulled up to the Safeway I worked at, and they're like, hey, and we were in Grand Prairie, and it's like, hey, we're going to Red Deer for like the Safeway competition. You want to come along? And I'm like, sure. And I thought for a moment, I'm like, I don't have to tell my parents I'm going. I can just go.
I'm free.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And that's the only time in my life I've ever experienced that. And it's like, and I always imagine, that's what single people have over me. I know you have a job and stuff, but I mean, it's like, you know what I mean? Different responsibilities. And I think you're a little
Yes.
more free in some ways.
It's true. Yeah,
Yeah.
there are different things, but I agree with you that I think that I just think there's a lot if I look back to who I was like 20 years ago and my ethics and what I thought I knew to be true and held, like it's evolved and changed so much that
Yeah.
now I'm really hesitant about what things am I going to put in my theological box as being sacred, right? It
Yeah.
used to be like, it used to, I need an entire like, semi truck to hold all of it. And now we've got a tiny little box, right? That's got
Yeah.
some core essentials in there. And so judging people now is really anathema to me because I did that in the past and I regret that because
Yeah.
now I'm like, I don't actually agree with the things that I used to judge people for back in the day, right? My
Yeah.
knowledge now is different and I don't want to be really careful about having too many people to have to go back to and say I'm sorry to. Really, it's managing the apology tour.
Well, and I think that's an interesting thing too that happens because like as people like deconstruct, they now become a lot more like okay with these kinds of different
Yeah.
lifestyle choices. I don't like the lifestyle, but like all these different ways of being that don't quite fit the I want to say factory settings. I don't know. But it's like, it doesn't fit the factory settings. It's like what do you call it? Like unlocked phones. Like, it's like
Yeah. That's
jailbreak.
hilarious. You go
I
back to your
jailbreaked my life. Right? It's like stupid Apple trying to limit what I can do. Right.
I know.
But I think that's a lot of it. Right. And it's like so now that I'm jailbroken, it's like now I look at the people that want to keep their Apple phone the way it is. And I'm like angry at them because they're trying to force everybody to keep their Apple phone the way it is. And it's like, well, it wasn't long ago that I was that person.
Mm-hmm.
And I feel like as I see people actually completely lose their faith, it's like they lose the ability to have grace for others.
Yes.
And it's like they can have grace for the sex worker, which is awesome,
Mm-hmm.
and have grace for like all these people who have different lifestyles that didn't fit with what they were okay with, but now they can't have grace for their former selves. When they run into people who are like their former selves, it's like, you're evil. And it's like, like and so it's like pursuing love, but also being able to admit when you fall short of love. And we will continue to fall short of love. And I think that's why I still need Christianity, because it's like, I know I will always fall short of love.
Yeah.
And I need that continuous process.
Yeah, that's the word that keeps coming to my mind is process, which if you want to get all fancy and theological is sanctification, right? Like
Yeah.
I think we give ourselves that space for process and incremental transformational change, but we don't want to allow that same process to be valid for other people. We expect them to have arrived right now. And it's just, and I think the hard part right now that I'm seeing in our world is because we've gotten so polarized on literally everything, it feels, we've lost our capacity to give the grace for process to other people and to believe that they could eventually arrive at a different place, right? We expect them to have arrived and be at the same spot I'm at, but I'm like, it actually took me 20 years to get to this spot, right? I'm okay with my journey, but I'm not okay with you taking 20 years to get there. You need to get there now.
And maybe they just don't want to be jailbroken, and they never will be jailbroken, and that's okay.
Some people like the walls and they like the confines. They like the safety of that. Because to be honest, like it was a lot simpler, right? When it was all easy to know. And, there was a file of facts of index cards I could go to go, what do I do in this situation? Right? Pull it out. That was a lot easier. It felt a lot safer. But it's also, I feel a lot more free and it's a bigger adventure to not be in the confines, but it's dangerous too, right? Like I think the worry that people have about the deconstruction about all of this is, but what if they walk away? That's a legitimate, valid fear. People legitimately look at all of it and decide, I don't want this anymore. I'm going to walk from it, right? And I think that's, the fear is real. The fear that, you'll just lose everything, or that if you pull that your faith sweater will unravel is actually a possibility, right? Because,
totally.
Yeah.
And, I have a friend who's in that position. Like, I got plugged into Joey Svensson's, I was telling you offline, but I'll tell you on the podcast.
Nice.
I got plugged into Joey Svensson's faith community, Bear With community. Which is now open to everybody. So people want to join it. I'll add a link to the show notes. I don't know why I did this. Bippity boppity show notes. For the audio listeners, I pointed to the left because that's where my other screen is. But anyways, so my friend Matt Oxley, and I've had him on this podcast too. And he talks about how he did his deconstruction journey like long before it was sexy. And he woke up one day basically, and it's like he killed God. And he can't bring God back to life. But he's still heavily involved in this like faith community. And he's like prominent on Joey's podcast. Joey's the pastor with no answers. And it's like he's like an atheist Christian. Like he
Mhm.
sees the value in Christianity, but he has no faith in God. And I look at that still, and I'm like, okay, so that I think God's okay with that. Like I think he understands where he's at. And I'm like, that's what I think. I'm like, and so I'm like, I find it hard to believe that God's like, okay, I know, Matt, that you still don't believe in me, so I'm gonna put you in hell for all
Mhm.
eternity, and the
Mhm.
fire is gonna, I don't know, whatever it does,
Melt
right?
your
And
face
it's
off.
yeah, 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 but like not in a cool way. Um,
Not in a cool way.
and I mean, and honestly, I don't really know what I believe about hell, because I know there's a lot of debate about like, oh, is
Hmm.
there like eternal conscious torment, or is there like
Annihilation, or
annihilation?
yeah, universalism. Yeah.
Yeah, universalism. It's funny, universalism, I always like everybody gets a ribbon. I mean, I'm told that would be awesome though. Like I want a ribbon, but I'm like, I don't know. But I love that Matt is pursuing love, and I see a lot more love in him than I see in a lot of Christians. And it's like
Well,
it's a beautiful thing.
aren't we told though that like the spirit is revealed by its fruit, right? So I
Yeah,
think we were never told we get to determine or judge the fruit, right?
yeah,
Or it's really not my business where somebody is with God and their
yeah.
relationship with God, or to define it. That's not my call. That's between that person, and ultimately it's God's call how
Oh
he
my gosh.
defines and receives that person, right? Not mine. I
Yeah,
don't tell God who to receive, right? And I think there's a lot more people that are honestly pursuing the heart of God that they wouldn't necessarily define it that way.
yeah,
Um,
yep,
and I think God's the one that recognizes and defines whether somebody's pursuing him or not. So I think I mean, I flirted and joked around for years with the concept of it being an agnostic Christian, because I just
yeah,
think like the whole concept of Christianity is it's a faith based religion, right? Well, doesn't faith mean that you don't actually know one way or the
yeah,
other? And
yeah,
so, therefore, that's the definition of agnosticism, right? So, as an agnostic Christian, I'm saying you can't know one way or the other. So, I throw my lot in to the Christian side of things instead of choosing to throw it in the lot of there is no God, right? But I
yeah,
mean, the truth is, it's all faith, right?
yeah.
It's all faith based, and we don't know for certain, right? That's why it takes faith, right?
Well, and I think the crazy thing is like I have faith in love.
Mhm,
It's like I believe love is everything. And it's
mhm,
like that's a kind of a crazy thing to believe. It's like,
mhm,
really? We don't need like, because people like when you say God is love, people are like, oh, well, he's also just. And I'm like, yeah, yeah, I get what you're saying. His love is just, but it's like the Bible says God is love. Like he's synonymous with love. It doesn't
mhm.
say that he's synonymous with justice.
No.
And it's like they want the justice because they want God to lower the boom on their enemies.
Mhm.
And it's like, but it's like that's if he's going to lower the boom on your enemies, he's going to do it out of love.
Yeah, well, and I mean, I think, I've always felt like there's two kind of weapons or tools that we have, right? We have grace and we have justice,
Uh-huh.
where we always seem to go to pick up the sword of justice, but it's gigantic and huge, unwieldy, and we have very little
Mm,
capacity to swing that thing around. And in swinging it around, with the inexpertise and like savagery that we do, we just end up like carving, and like breaking people right, left, and center with it. When the truth
yeah.
is, the one tool that we have as grace, right? I've experienced it, I've received it, I'm alive because of it. We always seem to go secondarily to that one, and yet we're completely fully equipped and experienced to wield that one around. But somehow we've decided that if we have to choose if people are in or out, we're going to err on the side of out, right? And I'm like,
Mm,
let's actually, what would it be if our default mode was grace, right? If we picked up grace first And then we just worked with that tool for a while to see what happens. Would justice also be served by using grace, right? As
Mm,
opposed to picking up this sword that's so dangerous that we have no call and no expertise to actually pick up and wield around. Um,
yeah,
yeah, I feel
that's
like
a
it's so
powerful
unfortunate.
image. I like
Yeah,
that.
too.
Um, okay, so how did you get into working for Sunshine Community Services?
Well, I applied for a job.
Uh-huh.
Shocking. And I started so Sunshine is a second stage women's shelter situated here in Calgary, Alberta. And we support women and children that are coming out of situations where they've experienced domestic violence and family violence. We have 24 units, like self-contained apartments, and these individual women or women with their children can come on site and stay for a year and experience safety, healing, wraparound supports to hopefully kind of launch them as they leave with a lot of tools, resources, connections. We work with the children. And so, yeah, so I started my first day of work, legit work, was the first day of lockdown, actually, in March 2020. So
I didn't know it was that recent.
yeah, it was really recent. So I've worked for years in the social work sector, working with children and families. So I've worked
Yeah.
with Big Brothers, Big Sisters, Boys and Girls Club. So I've worked, that's, where I've worked predominantly. And then this opportunity came forward, applied for it. Honestly, didn't think I was qualified at all, because while I've done a lot of work with families that have experienced violence and trauma in my work, this was a very specific focus on domestic violence and family violence. So lo and behold, get the job and start working. And then I started actually the end of February, but then my mom and I had a trip to London planned. So while we were in London, the world fell apart. We were the last
Wow.
flight to get in from London before they basically forced quarantine and everything on people. So so my first day of work was lockdown.
Wow.
And so it's been I don't know, I've loved it. It's
Yeah.
exactly where I need to be. And so I'm the director. My role has kind of shifted over the last few months, but I'm the director of all the children's programming and the family programming at Sunshine. So we have Canada's first trauma-informed daycare and children's center
Wow.
on site. And we also have obviously children's programming for all of the children, and from 0 to like 18 that are on site with their moms that have come out of situations of violence. And then we also have about 65 day homes that we're licensed or paid by the government to support. So we coach and work with all of the day home providers that take care of kiddos in Calgary. So yeah, and I'm in charge of that's my big umbrella of programming. So
Well, it's funny. I just jumped into this right after you were talking about the sword, but it was kind of interesting to me because whenever people talk about like justice and then they talk about grace and they say put down the sword of justice and let's bring grace, I always think of like the Mark Driscolls,
mhm.
and where it's just kind of like, oh, we need to give him grace. And it's like, I don't think that's our job to give him grace. Like that is up to the victims to work out,
Mhm.
figure out how to get past the trauma somehow and figure out like, find healing. And then it's like, now are you guys ready? Should Driscoll ever be put back into a position of power where you can do this again? Like there's all of that. And so I mean, like I think with the families, it's kind of like, okay, look, like the family's going to heal and work through it, but you're probably never going to get to be the dad again.
I think, I don't know what I think. I'm going to be careful how I say this,
Yeah, I know it's
because
you're dealing with this personally, so I'm talking about this
yeah,
theoretically. So I
It's
understand.
it's hard. I think
Yeah.
some very interesting stuff is starting to come out where they're finding that. So typically, the women escape, right?
Right.
They go to
Yeah.
an emergency shelter, and then from the emergency shelter, they then transfer through the system through second stage shelters like Sunshine and stuff like that into independent living and stuff like that. And the shelters are all kept secret. The perpetrators are completely excised out of that
Right.
family unit, kept away for very obvious reasons, like safety. Safety is a very real everyday thing that we have to look at and be thoughtful and cognizant of in the work that we do and for our families. But there's been some really interesting studies and work that's starting to happen with engaging the perpetrator right from the point that the family enters into the shelter. So the mom and the kids say enter into shelter, engaging with dad and going, hey, there's stuff going on, and your wife, partner, children are now going to be staying at the shelter. We're going to be providing some support. We're going to be providing them with some counseling, some things like that. We would also like to extend this offer to you and to engage you. So here's where they're at. They're safe. We've got them. You don't need to be worried about where they're at. And also, should you want to engage in something, you yourself can engage in some of this therapy to get help for what brought you to this point. And what they're finding is that the most dangerous man, it's not always men, but the most dangerous abuser is the
Right.
one who is kept completely in the dark and excised
Mm,
completely away, because they
mm,
have no control. They don't know where their people are at. Regardless of what we think about their parenting and the damage that is done to their children, a lot of these people do still love their children,
right.
right? And so have concerns for them. And so the dangerous perpetrator is the one that has no relationship at all to the people that are giving care and safety and support to the family. And so one of the big things we battle from the child side of things, which is my area of expertise and focus, is that actually legally we can't give therapy unless both parents give consent. So
Right.
it becomes a dance that we do with the abusive partners, the dads, because they can often coercively withhold consent for their children to be able to engage in the therapy and stuff that would really help them heal, as a way of continuing to have control. And so what we're starting to kind of wonder is, what would it be like to engage with dad, to go, you're not an evil, completely lost to all humanity person. To me, it makes some sense in that if you back these people so hard against a wall and say you are irredeemable, you
Right.
are without hope, there is no grace that can ever be given to you anymore, you are dangerous and we want nothing to do with you. um well, what else, what choice do they have but to continue along that path? Right?
Mm,
It sure isn't going to compel them to go, I've got a problem, I need help. I would say there's more chance of them coming to a place of going, I don't want to do this anymore. This isn't who I want. There are big issues going on, whatever they are, and I need help. I think we have a greater chance of engaging in that redemptive process than completely excising them and putting their backs against a wall and labeling them as irredeemable. With that said, that's hard to say
yeah.
for me, knowing the stories that I know of a lot of the families that I've worked with, and a lot of the abuse that I have seen inflicted on women and children is horrific, and it's very difficult to continue looking at those people like they are humans, right, and
Yeah.
not just evil monsters.
Yeah.
But I don't think it's my place to judge those people. I just have to be mindful of safety. So
Yeah.
while they're willfully not willing to engage in a healing and restorative, and if they're not willing to abide by and see and concede to the safety parameters and boundaries that have to be in place, then there's consequences to that, right?
Right.
They can't be then involved, right? But yeah, it's been interesting to kind of watch the evolution of what do we do with these individuals who perpetrate these
Yeah.
offenses, right? What that isn't saying is we extend them grace, like how the church right now is misusing that,
Right.
right? right? That is not what I'm saying at all. It's
Wow.
saying, nope, they need to own up actually fully. And if they don't fully own up to where they're at, what they've done, and do the work to figure out what brought them to that and to heal from that, then they continue to be a loaded gun that's ready to go off. And you cannot be flippant or naive about the danger, the damage that they can do.
This sounds like kind of similar to what I've learned a little bit about like indigenous justice.
Mhm.
And the other thing it reminds me of is like somebody was telling me um, how like he lived in a Muslim country, and within this Muslim country, it was basically if you do anything to anyone, you have a you come to the victim and you apologize. If
Mhm.
if the victim is okay with your apology, you don't go to jail. If they're not okay with your apology, you go to jail. And I was like,
Mhm.
that is so interesting to put all the power in the hands of
In
the
the hands of
victim.
the person, yeah, that's been disempowered and marginalized, yeah. And that's really a big piece of it, right? Is
Yeah.
And then I think for us to, I mean, one of the big learnings for me is that it's not cut and dry, the relationships that exist, right? It's
Right.
easy to paint and really, polarizing kind of like caricatures, right? Where dad is bad, he's an abuser, mom is saintly, she's the victim, right?
Right.
And that she now hates dad, or kids now see that dad is a bad guy and don't want anything to do. And it's not, these are legitimate, these are relationships. There is love, there's history, there's a lot of brokenness and danger that exists, and sometimes there's too much water under the bridge for that to be repaired fully or ever. But these are complicated relationships, and the biggest thing I've learned is that we tend to look at, so it takes on average, right, a woman 7 times of attempting to leave before she can actually leave and make it like stick, right? And I
Right.
think we tend to, those of us that haven't experienced this looking from the outside, go, what's her problem? Why doesn't she just leave? I don't understand. Like, it's so clear to us, right,
Yeah.
what the logical response needs to be in these situations. But having now walked with victims in these situations, um, there is a very strong current of logic and sense in the decision to go back. So if you are a woman whose husband is beating you, but he's not laying his hands on the kids, and to leave means that you now leave, you have no financial security, you have no home, you have no stability. You are introducing new traumas into your child's life, homelessness and financial insecurity. When you look at that as a mom and go, well, if I stay, my kids still have a relationship with their dad. They still have the safety and the security of their home and a financial security. And the cost of that is that I allow myself to experience hell. Right. There's a lot of parents that would opt to make that choice. There's a lot of families
Right.
in Ukraine right now where parents are doing without, trying to make it so that their kids have like the basic needs of life. Right. Like, this is a
Yeah.
very visceral parental choice that inherently has logic built into it. It's not illogical for a woman to make that choice in that situation. It is not the safe choice, right? Truth is, there is freedom to be had getting out of that. But if our society doesn't have the right infrastructure and supports in place, the legal systems in place, right, all of this to actually support a safe exit, they're maybe not entirely incorrect all the time about the dangers that exist from leaving as well,
Right.
because the legal systems are not set up to support the victims
Hmm.
by and large, right? And so if they can't like actually make good on their exit, they actually put themselves at more risk if they leave prematurely before they actually know that they have a place to stay and that they're going to be received. And I know many victims from, a faith background that have attempted to leave, have disclosed to people from their faith communities, and have been completely gaslit and not believed entirely. So in those situations, the decision to stay, intellectually we can look at that and go, that is a cost that is too great to pay. But when you look at actually all of the insecurities that get introduced into the lives of these families, It's a very logical choice for mom sometimes to go, the only cost is my cost, right?
Yeah.
But my kids don't have to bear the weight and the consequences. What I would say to women, and I do say to women in those situations, though, they're really underestimating how much their children know and understand about what's happening.
Wow. Yeah. Yeah.
So
Because
it's
it's like,
complicated.
yeah. And I know people who've witnessed a lot of things, and it's
Yes.
like that messes you up. I mean, you can get, just from people describing things, you can get PTSD. And I know people who have secondhand PTSD. It's like this, the impact is so wide.
Yep. I go to counseling because
It's
of
good.
the secondary trauma, right, of
Good.
hearing stories. Yep, it's a lot. And so I am not saying that women shouldn't exit. I hope that's clear. I'm just
Yeah.
saying the judgment that we on the outside
Yeah.
have towards these individuals, they're not stupid. They're not lacking in courage. They are the most courageous people that have been put in situations where they're having to choose, do I want to continue parenting my child or do I want to save my life, right? Do I want freedom from abuse? And these are decisions and situations that people should never be put into. They should never
No.
have to choose between those. And instead of really looking at that and going, what do we need to change with our systems so that people are never put in a situation where they have to make these Sophie's choices kind of choices? We just then turn it and we blame the victims, right? It's easier for us to turn our eyes and go, well, she could get out if she wants to get out. Well, not always is it that
Yeah.
simple.
And I mean,
Yeah.
when you're talking about logical choice too, I'm just like thinking, I'd imagine in that environment, it's very difficult to think logically to begin with.
Yeah. If you follow brain science, right?
Yeah.
Like when you're living your entire life with your amygdala firing off
Yeah.
constantly and your lizard brain is in control of you, right? Where you're literally in fight, flight, or freeze mode your entire like life for a long suspend, a long period of time. Yes, the neural pathways shut down. So the brain is an incredibly agile muscle, right? That like goes, okay, this is where she needs all this power. She doesn't need it up at executive function. We're going to
Right.
stop these neural pathways from firing because we need all of the power, right? It's Scotty going, we need the power, we need more power.
Yeah.
And it's redirecting all of the power back to the lizard brain, I call it, right? The
Yeah.
amygdala, where everything firing there, right? And so it's very difficult. But the cool thing is because we can actually see now a lot of what's happening in the brain function through all of the technology that we have now. We used to believe that neuroplasticity stopped at a certain age, like with childhood or up until like youth, right? And actually, they're realizing actually neuroplasticity where you retain that your entire life. So all you need to do is get somebody out of a situation and allow them opportunities where they're not firing here and give them opportunities to start re-engaging back up in executive function in the frontal lobe, and the brain starts rewiring everything again really really
Wow.
quickly. Like it is incredibly quickly healed and restorative. That's not to say that there aren't lifetime trauma issues people have to
Right.
kind of work through and triggers, but that capacity to kind of rebuild the neural pathways can happen really quickly, actually, once you get people out of the situation where they're having to focus so much on fight, flight, or freeze.
Wow. And that reminds me of Erwin McManus was
Yes.
interviewed by Lewis Howes a while back. And
Mhm.
Erwin McManus was saying, like, when you're in like stress mode and you're into the lizard brain, he's like, if you're able to look at your situation, and I probably not for these people, but for people in normal situations, if you're able to just stop for a moment and think, well, what do I have going for me? If you're able to find gratitude in that situation, it acts as a lubricant that gets you
Mhm.
from the lizard brain into the prefrontal cortex.
Mhm.
Then, did I say cortex? I might have. Cortex. Um,
This very unscientific
when I
brain
try to
discussion we're
sound
having.
smart here, um, but it's like so. Then you're actually able to think logically and solve your problem. And I was like, that's such a cool trick. I'm going to keep trying to use that trick.
It's very like the brain can be trained like any muscle,
Yeah.
right? And that's actually, so when women come into the shelter, we do an assessment called a danger assessment, which is, it's got, a number of different uses, but basically it's, 20 questions based on research that this researcher did in the States, where she looked at thousands of cases where women died by femicide, and then pulled out these 20 thematic situations that were indicative of when a woman was at danger, at risk of femicide, so murder by partner or spouse, and then created this like way of measuring the risk factor a woman comes in with. So obviously that's like incredibly useful for women to know, because they often have no idea how much danger they're actually in. So it's useful in that context. It's a very black and white way for a woman to assess her situation, to go, wow, anything 18 and above is high risk of femicide. I'm working with an individual right now who has a 2021 or 25 danger assessment, right? So it's a very clinical way for them to be able to look and go, whoa, this actually is dangerous. I'm not just making this up. There's things going on.
Mm.
The other interesting thing is there's another companion part to this tool that's called the calendar, where you get the client to go through a year, that go through a calendar, and to mark on the calendar. So say all of May or April, every time there was a situation of abuse, whether it was physical, financial, where they have to mark it on the calendar. And I was like, ooh, when I was getting trained in this, I'm like, isn't that like super traumatizing? And also they're not here with executive function, right? So how are they going to look back? Like, I can't even remember what I did last week. How are these women supposed to look back over the course of like months of stuff and chart out when abuse happened? And the trainer was like, actually, this part of the tool is about retraining the executive function, because it's forcing them to look at a very numbers based, calendar logical based tool, and to look at their situation through a very logical numbers based way. And what it does is your brain starts then rerouting right up to executive function, because it needs the executive function to actually be able to do it. So it quickly starts the brain going, ooh, we're doing something here where we need this frontal stuff, right? So it starts like rerouting. And so it's
Crazy.
functionally a really cool tool that also
Yeah.
helps them not only understand their situation, which is really key for them to be able to make some really, for safety planning, right? And for future oriented discussions around how do I keep myself safe and my family safe. But the process of doing it kind of reworks the neural pathways as well, which is, I think, is just fascinating. I love it.
Oh my gosh. I feel like I could just talk to you about brain science all day. It's
It's
fascinating.
so cool. It's very cool.
Okay, so the other thing, I guess we're kind of short on time here, but I'm just like, okay, can you like briefly talk about your dissertation? I think we have to do a whole episode on this, but
Sure.
can you just kind of give me the lowdown on what your dissertation was?
For sure. So it was a thesis. So I don't want to like, have airs that I'm like more educated than I am. It was my master's thesis.
Right.
And it's on the topic of theomacy. So when I was in seminary, I got my first semester or so got really captured. I did a scripture study on the story where Jacob wrestles with God at Jabbok, right? And started thinking about that in terms of my own relationship with God, and how there's always been this component of kind of wrestling and contention with God, and how I didn't believe that it was wrong. And that slowly through the process of really studying this thematically through the Bible, right, realizing this is actually not just wrong, it's actually a legitimate tool God initiates and uses to develop people's relationship and intimacy with him. So theomachy is a Greek word. It's a hybrid. So theo meaning God, and mach is the Greek word for war. So it was used in the context of Greek mythology when the men and the gods would war. So it was, they called those stories of theomachy. And so I just kind of repurposed it for this context to be a theological like framework and a theological look at the entire Bible, to pull out the stories and the themes of contention with God. And lo and behold, it's all the way through from from beginning to end, that there are these themes of contention with God, and that God often actually initiates these encounters with him, where we engage with him, wrestle with him, and yeah, and I think a lot of like the deconstruction we see, I think a better word for it would be theomaky. We see a lot of theomaky happening right now.
Mm.
And if we understood this concept, so I mean, it's cool. I mean, it's super interesting. I think maybe people are like, your definition of cool is wanting, but I think it's cool.
I'm with
But
you.
I think it's necessary. I think it's really needed, because there are so many people in this process, right, of contention and wrestling with God and church and theology and the Bible right now. And instead of carrying the weight of guilt that they're somehow falling away from the Lord, how we always,
Yeah.
they're straying from the Lord, instead of viewing it that way, to view it as a legitimate and actually God ordained and initiated tool of discipleship and intimacy development. I think we would be better if we were more conversant in this kind of relationship engagement with God. So I wrote a paper on it.
That's awesome. I want to read the paper.
It's like the worst writing I have ever done. I do have a blog that's far more interesting.
Okay.
But I can send the synopsis that I wrote of it, of the thesis. But yeah, I find it's really a very relevant topic for right now. I think it's relevant always, but right now there's like such a discussion going on. The church is really wrestling with itself, right? And its understanding of where did we lose our plumb line and how do we get back there? And actually, what is the plumb line?
I was just listening to this podcast episode. So someone recommended it's Voxology with Mike Erie.
Mm-hmm.
And they were talking about culture wars.
Mm-hmm.
And he said something. He said, we should not be warring outside of the church. We should be warring within the church.
Yep.
And I was like, that's what it is. It's like we need to, like, the whole church needs to do deconstruction.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that's what the problem is the church is not willing to deconstruct. Therefore, people are leaving the church to deconstruct.
Yes.
And it's like the divine unraveling. And I mean, you can see too, like I see the prophetic voices are outside the church.
Yes.
And there's a lot of false prophets in the church. And it's so messed up and so frustrating.
It's messed up, and it's ultimately really sad though, because they still think that they hold the truth, right?
Yeah.
And they have no idea that they've completely lost their grasp of it entirely, right? And I think the truth is, like, wrestling with God and warring and contention like this is best done if there's some midwives, right? To support that process. It is a process that is best done in community, where there are supportive people to kind of like, wipe the brow, the trainer that sits at the boxer's corner, right? And waits for the bell to ring, rushes in with the towel, with the water, with, to wipe them up and get them ready to keep on trucking. It's a journey that's best done in the context of a really wise community around. But we don't talk about this. Who are those people? Right.
We need churches like that.
Yeah, we do. Yeah. Sure. We need wise contention zones, right, within church. Yeah.
Beautiful. All right. So if you can send me a link to your blog, I'll put that in the show notes.
Sure.
I guess if people want to see your work, they can go to your blog page, and then follow you on Twitter would be another one. So I can put a link to that.
Yep. Yeah, I'm pretty active on Twitter. Mm-hmm. I do a lot of advocacy and trying to raise awareness about what the experience is for people in situations of domestic and family violence. So yeah, it's a great place to engage.
I feel like we got a lot of conversations that need to be had, so I'm just going to keep DMing you whenever something comes up.
Please do. This was refreshing and fun. I had a great time.
Well, thank you.
Yeah. Thank you.
Air Smudge.